Long before the white man ever cast his shadow on South Carolina, in the upper part of the state lived the Catawba Indians. We know them now as Cherokee. And it was in a village of the Cherokee, nestled in a small valley backed up to a tall, steep cliff, one spring morning, that the chief's wife began her labor pains. The chief paced and prayed silently outside of his lodge for a son. For you see, the years of age had begun to weigh heavily upon his shoulders, and he knew that the time would come when he would no longer be able to lead his people, and he would need a son to be the new chief. But his wife did not give him a son that day. She gave him two, so alike that even the mother for a while could not tell them apart. And she loved her children, and they grew and became stronger and older. And then, as was the custom of the people at that time, they were given names once it had been determined what kind of people that they were probably going to be. The one son, who loved to spend his time in the woods and with the animals and hunting, was given the name Walks in the Woods. His brother, who seemed more content being in the village and with his people and being a part of the community in all things, was given the name which means strong like a tree, for his roots were deep into the life of his people. And the sons grew stronger, and the father, the chief, grew weaker. And one day the time came, the time which the chief and his wife had both dreaded. And he called her to his side, where he lay in the bed, sick and weak. My wife, the time has come, and you know the choice that must be made. That choice is yours. You have brought these fine sons into the world. You must choose which is to be chief, and you must choose which is to be banished from his people forever. For you see, the chief and his wife both knew that there could be only one chief, only one son to take the father's place, and if the choice were made and the sons remained together, there would be nothing but trouble among the people. For you see, the people had grown fond of both future chiefs. And if one was chosen over the other, as long as the other remained in the village, there would always be those who said that he should be chief. And they feared that the day would come when there would be trouble, perhaps even a dividing of the tribe. So one son would stay, one son would leave. With a heavy heart, the mother walked out of the lodge, called her sons to her side, and they walked to a small clearing outside the village. And she turned to them and began to speak. But it was not news to the two young men, for they had realized that this day would come also. And as their mother stood there, and with a look of anguish, she asked them how could she choose which son was to be hers and which was to leave and never return again. Then Walks in the Woods reached down into the dirt and picked up two small stones, one slightly larger than the other, held them out and dropped them into his mother's hand. And she understood, for you see, in their youth as they had grown, there had come times when there was to be something given to one of them, and the choice had to be made who would receive it. So the mother would take two small stones and hide them behind her back, and the sons would pick, and the one who picked the larger stone would receive the gift. Walks in the Woods turned to his brother and motioned for Strong like a tree to choose. And he did, and the mother dropped a small stone into his hand, and he clasped it closed. And then she did the same to Walks in the Woods. Then, strong like a tree, slowly opened his hand and showed his stone. Walks in the Woods began to open his hand, but before his mother or his brother could see, he cast the stone into the bushes. And then he turned to his brother and he spoke, "My brother, my chief, I must prepare to leave." And then he walked from the clearing, followed by his mother. As he prepared his things to leave, his mother stood there, broken-hearted, but at the same time feeling pride. For she knew that Walks in the Woods had picked the larger stone. But yet he was willing to sacrifice his place for his brother, and that was a gift that she could not take from him. Bidding his family goodbye, Walks in the Woods left the village in a quick walk. He traveled for most of the day, and then his path began to alter. And night brought him back to the village from the outside edge where no one could see, and he followed a steep, narrow trail to the top of the cliff, and then on to a secret cave that only he knew of. And there he determined to live. For though he could not be with his people from this point, from his view, he could look down and he could see the village. He could watch the people. He could watch his brother become chief. He could watch the people grow, become stronger. He could watch the children become adults. And most of all, he would be able to be with his people. And he was happy. And his home was there, above the cliff, where he would stand in the trees and look down and watch. He made friends with the animals around him, especially one, the crow. Crow was a good friend, and he would fly down to the village and light in the top of a tree in the center and listen to all the things that went on, all the things that were said. And then he would return to Walks in the Woods and tell him all that he had heard and all that he had seen. And Crow allowed Walks in the Woods to become even more a part of his people without actually being there. Occasionally, from his position, he was even able to help his people, for once food began to grow scarce and the people were hungry. And with the help of Crow, Walks in the Woods traveled far until he was able to capture 2 deer alive. And he brought them back to the cliff and cast them over the side. The next morning, when Walks in the Woods, who was now chief of his people, for their father had died, found the 2 deer almost at the door of his lodge. And looking up, he thanked the Great Spirit for providing their food, and the people did not hunger. For they thought that the deer had been fighting up on the top of the cliff and had fallen over the side. And in this way, Walks in the Woods was able to provide for his people. And then, one day, another tribe, the Uchis, invaded their land. They were great in number and great in strength, mighty warriors. They sent a message to Strong Like a Tree. "We have come to your land to live. You are to leave, or we will drive you out and kill you." And that night the people sat around the great fire in the center of the village, and they all looked to Strong Like a Tree for their answers. For they were nowhere near as strong as the enemy. Surely they could not win the battle. But Strong Like a Tree had no answer. As chief, he could do nothing to save his people. They would lose their homes or they would die. Crow flew quickly to Walks in the Woods, to his cave, and woke him and told him all that had happened. Walks in the Woods stood on the edge of the cliff looking down at the fire and the smoke coming from the village and wondered what he could do to help his people. And then the idea came to him. And quickly he sent Crow to the enemy's camp. And at first light, Crow spoke to the chief of the enemy, and he told him, "I have a message for you from Strong Like a Tree, chief of the Cherokee. You are to come and bring 12 of your greatest warriors to the top of the cliff overlooking the village, and there you will parley with the chief of the Cherokee." The chief of the Yuchi and his warriors the next morning found themselves coming out of the woods and spotting there, standing on a tall or a large rock, a tall, strong chief. And he spoke to them. "I am strong like a tree, chief of the Cherokee. You are to leave our land, or you will die." This brought laughter, for they knew they were much stronger and much greater in power than these who lived there now. "You mock me, but you must understand the Great Spirit has given us special power. You see, we cannot die. If you kill us today, tomorrow we will be back. And you will kill us, and some of you will die, and we will return. And you will kill us again, but more of you will die. And this will go on until finally we are greater than you, and then you will all die, and we will still be here in our land. You expect warriors like ourselves to fear such a tale from you?" And then walks in the woods, stretched his arms out, palms up to show he had no weapon, and said, "O great chief, take your spear and cast it into my body, and have your warriors do likewise. See that I am dead, and then return in the morning, and you will find standing on this same rock the chief of the Cherokee, and you will know that I do not tell a tale which is not true." The enemy chief stepped forward, and with a mighty cast, his spear, with such force that it entered Walks in the Wood's chest, and the point came out the other side. And as he staggered back and grabbed a branch for support, the 12 warriors stepped forward and cast their spears at the same time, and the force was so great that it lifted Walks in the Woods from his feet, and he tumbled over the cliff and landed below on a ledge. And as the chief and his warriors looked over the side, they saw the broken, mangled, bloody body. And they gave a cry of triumph and returned to their camp, not knowing that at the very moment Crow was flying fast back towards the village. And there he spoke to Strong Like a Tree, and told him that he had a message from the Great Spirit, and that Strong Like a Tree was on the next morning to climb to the top of the cliff overlooking the village, and there he would find a large stone, and on that stone would be fresh blood, and he was to stand on that stone, and he was to watch for his enemy, and when he saw them, he was to tell them that they must leave that land or they would die. Walks in the Woods headed to the top of the cliff the next morning. And as he stood there wondering, there through the trees came the enemy. And as they reached a clearing, Strong Like a Tree pointed at them and spoke in a loud, booming voice, "I am Strong Like a Tree, chief of the Cherokee. You are to leave this land or you will die." And much to his surprise, the chief and his warriors threw down their weapons with a loud cry of alarm and quickly disappeared into the trees. They reached their camp, and by nightfall, all the warriors of the enemy were leaving the land of the Cherokee. As he stood there amazed at what had happened, Crow alighted on his shoulder. "I should not tell you this, for it is a secret shared by Walks in the Woods and myself." And at the mention of his brother's name, Strong Like a Tree was startled. And then Crow told him the story of what had happened. And then Strong Like a Tree looked over the side of the cliff, and there he saw his brother's body. And he returned to the village for help to get his brother and bury him. And there he told all the people gathered around the fire what had happened. And all the people came to the top of the cliff. And there they retrieved Walks in the Woods' body. And they had a great ceremony in his honor. For you see, in all the legends and all the stories and all the history of their tribe, never had the love of one man been so great to have done what he had done. Him, being an outcast, no longer allowed to live with his people, had sacrificed his life for theirs. And as they stood there, the old woman, Walks in the Woods' mother, began to weep. And unashamed, Strong as a Tree also. And then all the people began to weep. So sorrow-laden were their hearts for the loss of the love of Walks in the Woods. And they began to weep harder. And they wept for many days, unable to stand the grief which they felt. They wept so long that the ground could no longer hold the water which came from their eyes. And it seeped deep into the ground, and there it found the cracks in the stone of that large cliff and began to seep out of the cracks. And to the passerby, it would have seemed as though the rock itself was weeping. And today, if you travel into the mountains, you will occasionally find a rock-faced stone, or a large boulder, or a cliff. And there on the face, almost like tears, you will see water coming down. We call this Weeping Rock. And it is there to remind the Cherokee of the love that Walks in the Woods had for his people.